There is a particular kind of quiet that some people carry into adulthood. Not the peaceful kind, the watchful kind. It shows up in the way they scan a room before they relax in it, in the way they apologize for feelings before they've finished having them, in the way "I'm fine" becomes a reflex, not a truth. They were children once, in homes where love may have existed, but safety did not always come with it, where the ground could shift without warning, where being seen felt more dangerous than being invisible. Nobody called it trauma at the time. It simply felt like childhood. But the body remembers what the mind learned to explain away, and somewhere beneath the composed adult, a child is still listening for the door. Some children learn to speak before they learn to read a room. Others learn the room first. They notice things before they understand them. A tone shifting mid-sentence, a silence that lasts 1 second too long, the particular stillness that settles over a house right before something breaks. Long before they have language for danger, they have instinct for it. And instinct, unlike language, does not forget. This is not the childhood people picture when they imagine emotional harm. There is no single event to point to, no visible wound. Often, there is food on the table, a roof that holds, a family photo that looks, from the outside, entirely ordinary. This is what makes it so difficult to name. The absence of emotional safety rarely announces itself. It simply accumulates, quietly, in the space between what a child needed and what they were given. A child does not need perfection. What a child needs is predictability. The sense that love, once offered, will still be there tomorrow, unchanged by someone else's mood. What a child needs is permission to feel scared, or angry, or sad, without that feeling becoming a problem to manage or a burden to hide. Where this predictability is missing, something else takes its place. Vigilance. The child becomes a quiet expert in the emotional weather of the people around them, because their own sense of safety depends on it. Watch closely enough, the logic goes, and perhaps the storm can be avoided. Read the signs early enough, and perhaps there is still time to become smaller, quieter, easier, before the air in the room changes. This is not weakness. It is intelligence, applied to survival. A child in an unpredictable environment does not choose hypervigilance. It is built into them, the way a plant bends toward whatever light it can find, even if that light is inconsistent, even if it disappears without warning. From the outside, such children are often described in comforting language. Easy, mature for their age, no trouble at all. But ease, in a child, is not always peace. Sometimes it is the absence of permission to be anything else. A child who has learned that their needs are inconvenient will often stop voicing them, not because the needs disappeared, but because expressing them once cost more than it was worth. This is where the story begins. Not with a single wound, but with a slow, invisible education. An education in scanning instead of trusting, in shrinking instead of asking, in becoming fluent in everyone else's emotional state, while growing quietly illiterate in their own. It would be years before that child, now grown, sat in a quiet room of their own making and wondered why calm still felt unfamiliar, why kindness, when offered without condition, felt faintly suspicious, why rest itself seemed to require permission nobody was giving. They did not lack love, necessarily. What they lacked was the felt sense that love was safe to receive without vigilance attached to it, and that absence, subtle as it was, would shape nearly everything that came after. How they loved, how they worked, how they sat with themselves in silence. This chapter is not an accusation against anyone. It is simply a beginning, a recognition that somewhere in a smaller version of the person reading this, a child once learned to survive a room before they ever learned to enjoy one. That child is still, in quiet moments, listening. Emotional unsafety rarely arrives as a single event. More often, it arrives as a pattern, repeated so many times it becomes the wallpaper of a childhood, invisible precisely because it is everywhere. Consider the home where love was present but inconsistent, warm one evening, distant or irritable the next, with no clear thread connecting the two. A child raised in this rhythm does not conclude that love is absent. They conclude something more disorienting, that love is unreliable, and therefore something to be managed rather than trusted. They begin working for it, performing for it, becoming whatever version of themselves seems most likely to keep the warmth in the room a little longer. Consider too the home where feelings were not met but corrected. A child who cries and is told to stop crying learns, quickly, that the feeling itself was the mistake, not the event that caused it, the feeling. Grief becomes something to apologize for. Anger becomes something to suppress, before anyone notices it forming. Fear becomes a private, wordless thing, carried alone because voicing it once led to dismissal, ridicule, or a parent's own discomfort turned outward as irritation. There are quieter versions of this too, homes without any raised voices at all, where the harm lived in what was missing rather than what was present. A parent, exhausted or emotionally unavailable, who met a child's presence with distraction rather than attention. A household where achievement was praised and emotion was not, where a good report card earned warmth, but a bad day earned silence. In these homes, a child learns a quiet arithmetic. Love is conditional, and the condition is performance. None of this requires cruelty to take root. Most of the adults raising these children were not trying to cause harm. Many were repeating, without realizing it, the emotional climate of their own childhoods, passing forward what they themselves never received, simply because no one interrupted the pattern to show them another way. Understanding this is not about assigning blame. It is about tracing the origin of a wound accurately enough that it can eventually be tended to, rather than simply carried. What connects these different households is not the specific behavior, but the underlying message received by the child. Your emotional world is not a priority here. Sometimes that message was spoken. More often, it was demonstrated in a mood that determined the temperature of the house, in a need that went unmet one too many times, in the particular loneliness of feeling unseen by people who were, technically, right there. A child does not have the cognitive tools to understand any of this in real time. They cannot say, this is neglect, or this is emotional inconsistency. They can only feel the resulting confusion, the sense that something is wrong, paired with the belief that they themselves must be the reason. Children rarely blame their environment. They blame themselves. It is easier, in a strange way, to believe I am too sensitive than to accept my caregiver is unreliable, because the second thought threatens the very foundation a child depends on to survive. And so the walls go up, not dramatically but brick by brick, built from 1,000 small moments where safety was promised and then withdrawn. By the time that child becomes an adult, the walls are so old they no longer look like walls at all. They look like personality, like independence, like being low maintenance, easygoing, fine. But beneath the architecture of coping, the original blueprint remains. And it began, quietly, right here, in a home that may have looked, from the outside, like nothing was wrong at all. What happens in childhood does not stay in memory alone. It settles into the body, into the nervous system itself, shaping how a person will experience safety, or its absence, for decades afterward. Attachment theory offers one way to understand this. In the earliest years of life, a child's relationship with their primary caregivers becomes the template for what relationships are supposed to feel like. When caregiving is consistent and attuned, a child develops what researchers call secure attachment, an internal expectation that others can be trusted, that needs will generally be met, that closeness is safe. But when caregiving is unpredictable, dismissive or frightening, different patterns emerge. Anxious attachment, where closeness is craved but never quite trusted. Avoidant attachment, where independence becomes a shield against ever needing anyone again. Disorganized attachment, where the very people meant to provide safety were, at times, also the source of fear, leaving a child without a coherent strategy for connection at all. These are not character flaws, they are adaptations, encoded early, operating largely outside conscious awareness. The nervous system tells a parallel story. In a threatening or unpredictable environment, a child's autonomic nervous system learns to stay alert, scanning for danger, ready to respond at a moment's notice. This is often described as hypervigilance, and it is, fundamentally, a survival mechanism. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for the body's fight-or-flight response, becomes more easily activated. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, may run at chronically elevated levels. Over time, a nervous system shaped by early unpredictability begins to treat calm itself with suspicion. because in the environment where it was formed, calm was often the quiet before something shifted. This is why many adults who grew up without emotional safety describe a strange discomfort with peace, not because they dislike it, but because their nervous system was never taught that peace could be trusted to last. Some psychologists refer to this as a kind of learned threat anticipation, the body braced for impact, even in rooms where no impact is coming. Polyvagal theory, developed by researcher Stephen Porges, adds further texture here. It suggests the nervous system exists on a spectrum, from a state of safety and connection, to mobilization and fight or flight, to shutdown and disconnection, when danger feels inescapable. A child repeatedly exposed to unpredictable emotional environments may cycle rapidly between these states, or may settle into one as a kind of default. Some become permanently primed for vigilance. Others learn to shut down instead, disconnecting from feeling altogether, because feeling, in their early environment, was never safe to express. This also helps explain something many adults find confusing about themselves: the disproportionate intensity of certain reactions, a minor conflict that triggers overwhelming anxiety, a partner's neutral tone that feels, somehow, like danger, a silence that spirals into dread. These reactions rarely make sense in relation to the present moment, because they are not, in fact, about the present moment. They are the nervous system responding to an old pattern, using a body that never fully unlearned it. None of this is a life sentence. The nervous system, remarkably, retains a degree of plasticity throughout life, a capacity to learn new patterns of safety, given the right conditions and enough repetition. But that unlearning cannot begin without first understanding what was learned and why. The body was not overreacting. It was remembering. Every defense a child builds is, at the time, a form of intelligence. The tragedy is not that these defenses existed. The tragedy is that so many of them outlive their usefulness, hardening into a version of adulthood that quietly limits the very connection a person longs for. Consider the adult who has built a life around self-sufficiency, who prides themselves on needing no one, who feels a flicker of discomfort whenever someone offers help. This independence often looks, from the outside, like strength, and in many ways it once was. A child who learned that relying on others led to disappointment, adapted by relying only on themselves. But carried into adulthood, this same trait can become a quiet form of isolation. Asking for help starts to feel like exposure. Vulnerability starts to feel like danger, even in relationships that have given no indication of being unsafe. Consider, too, the adult shaped by people-pleasing, the instinct to anticipate others' needs before their own, to avoid conflict at almost any cost, to feel responsible for the moods of everyone in the room. This, too, was once protective. A child who learned that peace in the household depended on their own compliance adapts by becoming endlessly accommodating. But an adult who cannot say no, who apologizes reflexively, who mistakes their own exhaustion for selfishness whenever they consider resting, this adult is still, in a sense, managing a household that no longer exists. There is the adult who fears closeness precisely because they want it so badly, who pulls away at the first sign of real intimacy, not from indifference, but from a deep, wordless conviction that closeness always precedes loss. And there is the adult who feels little at all, emotionally flattened, disconnected from their own inner life, because feeling deeply once meant feeling unbearably alone with it. What makes these patterns so difficult to address is that they rarely feel like patterns from the inside. They feel like personality, like preference. I just like doing things myself. I'm just not a big feelings person. I just don't like relying on people. The armor has been worn so long, it has become indistinguishable from skin. And so when these patterns are gently named, in a therapist's office, in a moment of unexpected vulnerability, in a friend's careful observation, the first response is often resistance, not because the observation is wrong, but because it threatens an identity built, brick by brick, out of necessity. To consider that the independence was really self-protection, that the people-pleasing was really fear, that the emotional distance was really an old wound in disguise. This requires facing something painful, the environment that built these defenses. There is grief in that, and grief, for someone who learned early that emotion was inconvenient, is its own kind of threat. This resistance is not stubbornness. It is loyalty to a strategy that once kept a child safe, and to the belief that abandoning it might leave them unprotected. The armor does not come off simply because it is uncomfortable. It comes off, slowly, when a person begins to trust that safety no longer depends on wearing it. That trust cannot be rushed, but it can, eventually, begin. There is often no dramatic scene attached to the moment someone first recognizes their own pattern. No thunderclap of realization. More often, it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary evening, during an unremarkable conversation, in the pause after a reaction that felt, for the first time, slightly too large for its cause. Perhaps it happens when a partner says something mild, an offhand comment, not even critical, and the response inside feels wildly disproportionate. A wave of shame, an urge to withdraw, a racing heart over something that, rationally, does not seem to warrant it. And in that gap between the size of the event and the size of the reaction, a question begins to form. Why did that feel so much bigger than it was? Or perhaps it happens in a moment of unexpected kindness, someone offering help or comfort or consistency. And instead of relief, there is suspicion, a quiet, involuntary thought. What do they want from me? What is this going to cost later? And in noticing that suspicion, a person may pause long enough to ask where it came from and realize, with some discomfort, that it did not come from this relationship at all. This is the beginning of what might be called the turning point. Not a single dramatic epiphany, but a widening crack in the wall of explanation a person has built around their own behavior. For years, the pattern had a story. I'm just independent. I'm just cautious. I just don't like conflict. These stories are not lies exactly. They are incomplete truths, offered by a mind trying to make sense of a body that reacts before thought arrives. The turning point is what happens when the incomplete story stops being enough. Often, this recognition arrives through reflection prompted by something external, a conversation with a therapist, a passage in a book, a documentary very much like this one, watched at the right moment in a person's life. Something names a pattern the person has lived inside for so long they had stopped seeing its edges. And in that naming there is a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief, because the behavior finally makes sense. It was never a character flaw, only an old adaptation working exactly as designed. Grief, because making sense of it means acknowledging what it was protecting against in the first place. This moment does not fix anything by itself. Insight is not the same as healing. A person can understand exactly where a pattern came from and still find themselves reacting the same way the following week. But something has shifted, even so. The pattern is no longer invisible. It has a name, a history, a reason. And once something has a name, it becomes possible to relate to it differently, not as an identity to defend, but as an old habit that can, with time, be gently unlearned. This is often the quietest and most private turning point a person will ever experience. Rarely witnessed by anyone else, rarely announced. Simply a moment, alone, where the fog around a lifelong pattern thins just enough to reveal its shape, and where a person begins, for the first time, to wonder what life might feel like without carrying it. Healing from a childhood without emotional safety is rarely about erasing the past. The past cannot be edited. What can change is a person's relationship to their own present. The slow, patient work of teaching a nervous system that today is not yesterday, even when old patterns insist otherwise. This process often begins with something deceptively simple: staying. Staying in a difficult conversation instead of withdrawing. Staying present through a wave of anxiety instead of numbing it away. Staying in a relationship long enough to discover that this disagreement did not, in fact, end in the abandonment an old pattern predicted. Each of these small acts of staying is a kind of evidence, offered to a nervous system that has spent years collecting evidence of the opposite. This is slow work, and it rarely moves in a straight line. A person may spend months building a felt sense of safety, only to find an old reaction resurfacing in a moment of stress. The withdrawal, the suspicion, the reflexive apology for a feeling that needed no apology at all. This is not failure, it is simply how deeply learned patterns behave. They fade unevenly, not all at once. What matters is not the absence of old reactions, but the growing ability to notice them without being entirely governed by them. Nervous system regulation plays a quiet but essential role here. Practices that calm the body, slow breath, grounding through the senses, movement, rest, do not erase the past, but they widen the gap between trigger and reaction, offering a person a few more seconds of choice than they once had. Over time, these small widened gaps accumulate into something larger, a felt sense, however fragile at first, that the body can return to calm without something bad happening on the way there. Relationships matter enormously in this process, though not in the way old patterns might expect. Healing rarely happens through relationships that recreate the original unpredictability, chasing the same chaotic warmth that once felt like love. It tends to happen, instead, through relationships offering something quieter and, at first, almost unfamiliar: consistency. A friend who shows up the same way, again and again. A partner whose affection does not depend on performance. A therapist who remains steady, even when old fears try to test that steadiness. These relationships do not fix anything by force. They simply exist, patiently, long enough for an old nervous system to slowly recalibrate what safety can feel like. Self-trust rebuilds in a similar fashion, not through grand declarations, but through small, repeated acts of honoring one's own needs. Saying no without over-explaining it, naming a feeling instead of minimizing it, asking for something and discovering that the request did not, in fact, cost the relationship anything at all. Each of these moments is modest on its own. Together, over months and years, they begin to form a different internal architecture, one built not on vigilance, but on the accumulating evidence that this version of safety is allowed to last. This is not a process with a finish line. There is no single day when a person becomes fully healed, watching the old patterns disappear forever. Healing, in this context, looks more like an ongoing practice, a willingness to keep choosing safety again and again, even when the old wiring suggests otherwise. Slowly, though, the choosing gets easier, and what once required immense effort begins, gradually, to feel a little more like home. There is a particular kind of stillness that arrives only after a long vigilance has finally been allowed to rest. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, in ordinary moments, a Sunday afternoon with nothing demanding attention, and instead of restlessness, there is simply peace, a disagreement with someone loved, resolved without the old bracing for disaster. A silence in a room that no longer needs to be filled, interpreted, or feared. This is not the same as forgetting. The child who once learned to read a room before trusting it does not disappear. In some quiet way they remain, a part of the story that shaped everything that came after. But they are no longer alone in that room. There is, now, an adult beside them, one who understands what that child was protecting against, and who no longer needs the same defenses to feel safe. What changes, in the end, is not the past. The past remains exactly as it was. What changes is the weight it carries into the present, the difference between a wound that governs every reaction and a wound that has simply become part of a longer, fuller story. Healing does not mean the walls never existed. It means they are no longer load-bearing. Somewhere in this process, a strange kind of gratitude often emerges, not for the pain itself, but for the resilience it required. The same vigilance that once felt like a burden becomes, with time, recognizable as a form of quiet intelligence. The same sensitivity that once seemed like a liability becomes a capacity for depth, for empathy, for noticing what others miss. Nothing about the original wound is erased, but its meaning shifts, gently, from something purely painful into something that also, eventually, became a source of strength. This is not a story about becoming someone new. It is a story about becoming familiar, at last, with who was always there beneath the armor. A person capable of rest, of trust, of receiving love without first checking it for danger. That person was never absent. They were simply waiting, patiently, for enough safety to finally step forward. And so the story that began with a child listening for the door ends somewhere quieter. Somewhere the door is simply a door. Somewhere the house is calm, not because nothing ever went wrong there, but because the person standing in it has finally learned they are allowed to stay, exhale, and rest.